everybody in the organization knows who you are, of course, and a lot of people know who you are. But there's probably some viewers of our podcast who may not know. So let's do a brief rundown of your bio. When did you
Okay,
meet?
so I can't, I'm not really good with dates. I'm good with like chronologies. I can put things in order, but I'm not good with dates.
The 90s.
So you and I met for the first time in Florida, probably 96, 97. Um, you did a seminar. Well, we met on email,
Mm-hmm.
if that's the way. So after you put out the functional JKD series, I bought it, or I should say, my wife bought it for me. There's this running joke in my house. There's my wife walking by right now. Hi, Dana.
Hey, Dana.
Matt says hello. There's this running joke in my house that I had all those videotapes to start with. I had the Bunak video series, I had your video series, and Dana paid for all of them because I didn't have a job. So Dana bought me those, and I started watching them. I thought they were awesome, and then I sent you a text message about them. And
I remember. I
you remember
remember.
that? I
I
wish we
do.
had that.
I remember. I remember specifically that you mentioned that you had the quote that in the arena Teddy Roosevelt quote that was in the first videos, the aliveness videos, and you had that. You said you had that up on your wall at your gym.
Yeah.
And that's what got us talking to begin with. So it would have been.
Well, I reached out because of the aliveness.
Right.
Because we had been doing, and it's funny that I don't know if I'm exactly, was the last podcast Burton?
Yeah, I mean, the last podcast that came out on videos, Burton, I've been doing a lot of talking.
Okay. Gotcha. I think you put out Burton set at the same time you put the functional JKD set out.
A little while after, but yeah, it was within a couple of years or so, a year.
Well, that's the world that we were in at that point.
Right.
And I knew you were in that world in a peripheral sense.
Right.
So we had been trying to figure out how to balance what is now the only way we train with aliveness with all the other stuff that we were learning and collecting, which was a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. It was a lot of fun, but I don't think that you can do both things congruently. And so I didn't know. I wanted to learn how to balance it, and I was hoping you would guide me there.
Right. And I don't want to interrupt you because I want to continue on with that chronology, but let's stop right there real quick because I of course I agree with you, but that's not always an easy conversation to have, and obviously we all still get a little bit of pushback on that. And I can even see from some of the comments from the video I did with Burton, the podcast with Burton, there are people who are still trying to walk the line and do both, and haven't come to the same conclusions that we have, I think, as the whole organization has about that. What would you say to those people as to why you don't think they're congruent?
You know Francis Collins?
The scientist.
Right. So he was the head of the NIH.
Yeah.
And this is not to get into religion and things, but I find it fascinating that he was almost a born-again Christian. And there's a whole story about him in the woods and 3 frozen waterfalls. Mm-hmm. Yet every day he got up to go to work to crack the code for DNA. I mean, I believe that he was a very important part in the final sequencing of the genome.
Yeah.
And I never understood how he could hold those two views. And in some ways, I see trying to balance alive with, I'm not going to say dead because we do train dead sometimes. What would you use for the other side?
Sclerotic tradition. So it's a dead pattern, a series of dead patterns. So it's just a dead tradition.
Okay. So I don't think that one can balance two things that are so far apart from each other. Mm-hmm. I don't know how if you end up in the middle, then you lose everything. Mm-hmm. So I think people need to pick a path.
Mm.
And if that path is supposed to lead to truth, then you can't hold on to falsehoods at the same time.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
No, it makes sense. Obviously, like I said, I completely agree with you. I think it's even more to your point with Francis Crick, the argument that I'm sure he makes and that people will make for him is
Not Francis Crick.
Francis Collins. Sorry.
Francis Collins.
Yeah. The argument that I think he makes and that other people will make for him as well, it's not, non-overlapping magisteria, the old Stephen Jay Gould argument. But with martial arts, it's not that at all. We're actually talking about theoretically the same thing, unless the instructor comes right out and says, we're only doing this for cultural reasons. It has nothing to do with fighting, which of course they never do. They're actually trying to blend astrology with astronomy. That's the way I look at it, And why would I steer a student and go, yeah, no, you should really go study astrology for 3 years before you go get your degree in astronomy, because that's going to be useful. How? Right?
Yeah, and the thing, even now, so I'm going to take stick work as an example. I am glad that we did all that stick work, but I'm going to tell you why. It forced us to do something that was incredibly boring, which was move our feet around.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing more boring than shadow boxing or footwork. Now I've grown to love it, and I think it's one of the best training tools.
Yeah.
But I was speaking to Rory about this because I always prize myself as a big guy for the way I can move around. Can't dance, but I can move around in a ring or a cage.
Right.
And I developed so much of that through being forced to do it with the stick work. Now, it's not the better way to do it, which is what I figured out. So I am glad that we did it, and it helped me. I got a benefit from it. But it was circumtuitous, because most things don't transfer over. And maybe that's where we could remove a lot of that, or what is claimed. So we've both heard, like, the tip of a stick is moving 80 miles an hour. Okay, so is my car sometimes. But I'm not going to have someone drive a car at me and evade it because it might help me slip a jab. I'd much rather have someone actually throw a jab at me. And since we all have a limited amount of time, I don't believe, do you believe in crossover? Do you believe, like, when you train one thing in another area, that it has a tremendous amount of crossover in another thing?
Not necessarily. I think you can take lessons from that and how to learn, but in terms of direct applicable skills, I think you'd have to be doing something that, like we're saying, is congruent with the other activity mechanically.
So my goal was to get good at boxing.
Right.
I would have been much better served spending all that time doing footwork in a boxing sense.
Right.
And having people throw jabs at me.
Right.
So I never look at the time that I spent doing all those other things as loss. There was certainly things that I carried with me, but there was a lot of wasted time.
Right. And you don't make your current students, and to be clear, I'm sure no one doubts the fact that like most teachers, you want your current students to get as good as possible, as quickly as possible. They're a direct reflection of you as a teacher. So we all have the right intrinsic motivation there. And you don't take them through that process, though.
No, I never would.
Right.
And I do believe that if I had been doing things within the context of the end goal, I would have got there quicker.
Yeah.
But I don't. I want to at least give a little bit of credit where credit's due.
Sure.
That
your own journey.
Right, exactly. That for me, it was a part of my journey that I would never give back, because it forced me to do something that at that point I was probably not mature enough to do on my own. Then when I got in a boxing gym and my coach was like, I just want you to move around this ring for the next few weeks. I don't want you to spar. I don't want you to pads. I don't want you to do anything. Then I understood.
That's exactly what happened to me when I first went to the gym, by the way. And I was so frustrated by that. But I just had to move around and then do, 2 or 3 hour workouts on the bag and mitts for 6 months before he ever let me spar.
Yeah, so he let me spar during that first couple weeks because my boxing coach had another philosophy, which was, should I waste my time training you?
Right. Yeah, sure. He was looking to weed you out if you needed to.
Yes. Yeah. And so there were a couple other heavyweights in that gym, and I became their sparring partner or their punching bag at that point. But I very, very, very quickly learned a good defense. So it was valuable. I also learned very quickly what I was going to be capable of starting boxing at a later age. I think boxing is generally a young man's game.
Sure.
And I think it requires, so let's talk after this, as we get through this, I want to talk about the difference between the two training modalities that we do, the stand-up and the ground, and where I think they differ and where I think maybe some of our disconnect happens with other people.
Okay.
So when I get back to that,
I think,
but go ahead, sorry.
Not to derail your train of thought, but I think too, the other point that sometimes people miss is, what we're looking for in SBG, and what I think anybody that's going to take a scientific approach to fighting is going to be looking for, is the commonalities between the things that everybody has in common. So the way I always define a fundamental, and you can have a strong background in Greco-Roman and put a gi on and very quickly adapt some skills in judo. You can have a strong background in judo and you can transition into folk style and freestyle wrestling, and you're still going to have a hip toss, and you're going to have a lot of the mechanics for a proper back step. And because throwing is throwing, you could do Mongolian wrestling, you could do any functional combat sport that involves clinch and grappling. Because to me, they're all, depending on the rule set, different aspects, like the clothing and the time limits and what's allowed and what's not allowed. They're different aspects of the same delivery system, whether we're talking about Sambo, judo, Greco-Roman, folk style, freestyle, even Muay Thai clinch. But you can't insert Wing Chun or you can't insert Silat because it's not a delivery system. It's just a different animal. And I think that's
right. I'm not talking about it from that sense.
Yeah.
Okay. You notice
people miss that.
Sure. Yes. I agree 100%.
Yeah.
If there is a throw that works, that I'm going to just use Silat, but I'm not knocking on Silat, but I am.
Yeah.
But hopefully no one shows up at my house with a sarong and a karambit. Is that what it is?
I don't even know.
If there is a throw that works really well in Silat,
right,
I would bet that it already exists in wrestling, or the things that we call wrestling.
Right.
And it's probably done much better.
Right.
And so why start at Silat to get all the way to wrestling? And the experiment, the judo, or the wrestling to judo experiment actually happened when the Soviet Union broke up. All those little countries had their own athletes that there are limited spots for wrestling, there are limited spots for judo, but wrestling was where the hardest competition was. And since these countries were new, they didn't have judo teams. So the judo teams were founded mostly out of former wrestlers. And they did so well in the world of judo that judo had to change its rules. And I don't know what the rules look like right now, but they removed a lot of the ability to touch the legs. Because a wrestler would come in his low wrestling stance, get grips, and attack the legs.
Yeah.
And so they were able to win to the point that judo had to remove that to remove the advantage that some of these wrestlers had. Right.
That's interesting.
But it speaks directly to your point. Like Sharp always says, wrestling is wrestling.
Right.
I, I, I'm having a hard time in my own house with a daughter who loves wrestling,
Mhm.
and judo, but doesn't love jiu-jitsu. And I'm trying to explain to her, it's just all wrestling.
Right. Right. And if we go, if we transition to stand-up, you're going to have Muay Thai and Savate and Western boxing and in all the other variations, but they're all essentially a boxing delivery system, boxing fundamental delivery system. And you all of a sudden switch to a horse stance and a Okinawan reverse punch is very difficult. So I think people who don't have
But
already a really extensive background in a combat sport sometimes they don't quite understand what the delivery system is. They think it's still like an all-you-can-eat buffet where you can take a little Malaysian and a little Japanese karate and put it together, but it's not how fighting works.
no. And if there is something from karate that works, I can teach someone with good stand-up fundamentals that technique.
Right.
Right. And if it's even necessary,
Right.
because I would question, how much, just like in jiu-jitsu, you and I are black belts. We've been doing this for 20 years each, but when we roll, we do about 8 different things.
Mm-hmm.
We probably know thousands of things, but we do 8 different things. It's all fundamental movements and a couple positions that we try and funnel everything into, let's say. Stand up, I don't know, boxing, it's 4 things: jab, cross, hook, uppercut, overhand, if you want to, make another thing. I wonder how much extra anyone needs to put into that. Add a couple leg kicks, and then sure, if you're tall and you like kicking, we could find a kick from karate, like a spinning back kick or taekwondo, that you could add to your game very easily without ever having to take taekwondo.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think the disconnect at some level between the world that we came from, the JKD world, and the world that we exist in now, is the difference between how to train stand-up and how to train grappling. Because I think you and I have spoken about this before. In grappling, once someone has gone through the introductory stage, they can do the move, then the rest of their lives is about the timing of that movement.
Mm-hmm.
They have to refine the technique, obviously. A black belt does things better than a white belt, but you can't do that up front. So if we ask the student to do 1,000 reps of the arm bar, they still wouldn't understand the mechanics and how to do it properly when a load was applied to them.
Right.
So it's what we do, and most places do, is we mix those two. Mm-hmm. They tighten the technical components of the movement over time as all of those movements are refined. Mm-hmm. Like a spinning armbar in a vacuum, they will never understand that until they understand how to move when someone's in their closed guard.
Right.
So we start applying pressure as quickly as possible and building timing. Stand-up works a little differently. Can you throw a baseball?
Not well.
It is a very complex movement. Mm-hmm. It is not dissimilar in certain ways from throwing a cross. And for some reason, the coordination needed to be good at stand-up, to look and move like a natural striker, requires maybe 10x more time in what we call dead training.
Well, introduction phase is how we
yes, the introduction phase, the footwork by itself, hitting the bag, throwing combos during footwork, hitting the hand pads, not this, some great coaches can really cross over that hand pad work, but I just mean hitting your combos over and over.
Right.
I think it takes so much more time. And you can't short circuit it by giving someone a stick or a knife.
Right.
But I think what you can do is an attempt to keep people from getting really bored. But it doesn't work that way.
Sure.
You can't transfer over. So to be really good at stand-up just requires you to get comfortable being bored doing a lot of solo training and stand-up before it's even worthwhile adding the components that make timing, that if that makes sense.
Sure.
So I think, so if, and I've watched you have this argument for years, hitting the heavy bag, we don't claim that is a live training.
No.
We just claim that it is necessary and sport specific.
Yes, the sports specific, activity specific part of it is completely lost on a lot of people. The importance of that in terms of saving time, right? Because we all have limited time.
We all have limited time. And sure, if a kid comes into the gym who has played basketball or tennis or even soccer and has spent years moving on their toes and keeping their body in balance in space, they will have an advantage over someone starting from zero in the footwork category. And that is a benefit, and I do believe most people should do multiple sports as they grow up. But we're not saying the soccer training was to get better at stand-up.
Right.
It just happened that way. We didn't try and force it. So, but I think that, and I watched you go through that over and over and over. And because it makes up a larger component of training than it does in jiu-jitsu. In jiu-jitsu, we teach someone how long does it take to teach someone a move?
Right. 5
minutes, they can do it.
Right.
You know, most people can pull off anything we show them within 5 or maybe 2 5-minute reps.
Right.
Do it, correct a little bit, do it again. They can do it. And so much of our time was spent drilling, what we call drilling in SBG. In stand-up, in an academy building good stand-up, there is so much time spent doing the introductory phase that I think people saw that and got confused because they felt that they were doing the same thing.
Maybe. And what you're saying is really logical, but I think you're still giving them too much credit. And I'll tell you why.
Maybe. Go ahead.
The reason why I think you're giving them too much credit is the nature in which the arguments arise. They arose back then in a particular order, and they arise the same way in a particular order. In that, the first thing you're going to encounter is it works. And then, fortunately, what we do in martial arts, it's empirical and testable. And you can get past that one really quick. You're not going to be able to execute that movement against anybody that knows what they're doing, and you can prove that. And so then the argument switches from it works to it's useful. And that's where you would have them say, well, this isn't for self-preservation. This is for self-perfection. Or the stick moves so much faster that we're developing attributes that are going to cross over for footwork, right? But I think that those kind of explanations came in only when they had to come in, because they got called on the fact that it doesn't actually work in fighting. And when that one gets overcome, and you can say, well, A, that's not necessarily true. You may just, in fact, be developing bad habits. And B, we have an activity-specific movement that we can show you that will get you the same, what you're looking for much quicker in a way that has a direct crossover to what we're actually doing. Then all they're left with is the third one, which is attack the messenger.
Yeah, it's non-falsifiable.
Right.
I guess I'm just thinking back to after you spent time all those years ago knocking those down, then people would say, what about hitting the heavy bag?
Exactly.
What about jumping rope?
Right.
What about shadow boxing? What about hitting the pads? And your answer to that was always, well, those are necessary training modalities for being good at stand-up, but
right.
They are still directly training for the end goal of being good at stand-up.
Right.
But I just remember for so long that those were where the arguments eventually went, heavy bag and stand-up. And the difficulty in that is the fact that, yes, we have to do so much heavy bag work. We have to do so much pad work to get guys to be natural strikers. So I think we're seeing this resurgence in both the stand-up world and the BJJ world of schools that almost all of their training is alive, but trying to add to the curricula flow patterns or 12 count tie pad sets or these real complicated patterns and drills again. And it's mostly, again, I don't know if any of those coaches would tell you that they believe that that is a better way to get people good. I think that if they were being honest, especially the stand-up guys, if they were being honest, they would tell you that it's mostly because training stand-up either is boring or sucks for most people.
Right.
Like, it's either boring because you have to do all that solo stuff, or it sucks because at some level there are punches coming towards your face. But why is it showing up in the BJJ world again? Why are these patterns and things showing up?
Well, we talk about this all the time, but my answer is, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but my answer is because people still don't understand aliveness. They'll equate aliveness to sparring. Well, we spar. And that always sends off red flags to me, because the moment somebody's equating aliveness to sparring, I almost always know that they don't quite understand what we're talking about. And more importantly than the way it impacts training, I think sometimes is the way it impacts the way you think. When you understand it, it becomes, I think anybody that truly understands aliveness is virtually impossible to fool with bullshit when it comes to martial arts. It's like a foolproof bullshit detector kit for martial arts. And if you don't understand aliveness, you could be a professional fighter, you could be a world champion, you could be an Olympic wrestler, and still be bamboozled by some Aikido guy that does some hokey demonstration of inner strength or who knows what. In the same way that the analogy I often use is Uri Geller fooling physicists and scientists because they just had no background in magic. And he wasn't even a good magician. He was a two-bit shoddy magician, but he was able to get away with it. So that's why I keep always going back to aliveness, and I steer people away from the concept of, well, it's just sparring or it's just pressure testing, because as you know, it's part of everything we do from day one all the way through. But I still think that a lot of people misunderstand that. That's why I think it comes in there. But I do take the point about how much easier it is to train jiu-jitsu with aliveness than it is stand-up, and how that does create a vacuum in a way.
That's exactly, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And so, if you understand aliveness and you understand how to create drills, and I'm always very careful. I'll say, let's drill this, but then I correct myself. I'm like, no, let's just go rep this, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need to rep this.
Mm-hmm.
A drill is a thing that has, I don't know if rules is right. It has specifications on what the goals are, what each person's doing, what the resistance looks like. And if a person understands that, especially in jiu-jitsu, they'll never run out of training drills. They'll never have students who are bored, and there should be no reason to want to create flows and things other than they look cool on social media.
Right.
In stand-up, it can be the same way. The problem is the other person in the equation has a little more room to break the bounds of that drill.
Yes.
And usually on accident.
Yeah. Yeah. There's another piece there too, I think, and it has both good and bad effects. I have seen people occasionally move away from jujitsu or de-emphasize jujitsu and emphasize more street, quote unquote, training. And I'm not talking about Burton. I don't want anybody to draw that assumption, because I like Burton. I think he's on a good path. I'm talking about my own students in times past.
Okay.
I would see them veer away from jujitsu and gravitate more towards, oh, we want to train more functional street, and they'll focus more on clinch and stand up. And part of, and I know you've seen this too, and we both recognize part of what's there. And part of what's there is the fact that it's impossible to hide your weaknesses in jujitsu, because if you're rolling to submission, right? Because you will get tapped. You're going to get tapped out. You're going to get held down. You're going to be dominated, and there's just no, well, I did pretty good, or I didn't. He got you. He got the choke or whatever, and that's part of what makes it so healthy. But, you can play clinch, you can pummel, you can even box and exchange blows with somebody who's a much better striker than you are, a much better grappler or clinch person than you are, and still make it appear like a game and protect your ego in a way that you can't with jiu-jitsu. And so I unfortunately, I see sometimes these guys gravitate more towards that, and the excuse they'll use is street. But in reality, it's just a way to avoid the rigid rod of truth, as Wunak would say, which is inevitable with jiu-jitsu. And that same, and I don't think that everybody does that, but I've seen people fall for that. But the same reason why people who are avoiding rolling and having to confront all the stuff that happens as you age or your athletes get younger or whatever when you're rolling, the same reasons clinch and stand-up doesn't force that same level of recognition on you is the same reasons why it's easy to insert all this other stuff that you're talking about. If you come in with a goofy lock or something like that and you try it in jiu-jitsu, the guy's just gonna, well, that's not gonna work.
Right.
But you can pretend to sneak who knows what in a stand-up play.
But you do, so you are seeing a similar, so that I would make this argument, you are seeing the same thing move its way back into jiu-jitsu.
Sure.
Because there are now plenty of schools who are just quote unquote self-defense schools,
right?
Which not always, but generally means that their students are not rolling in a free form manner where, it's you and me tap and we go to submission.
Mm-hmm.
And they're generally not competing, and they're generally not allowing outsiders in to roll with them.
Yes.
And I've seen this happen more and more. I've seen
one of those. Don't you have one of those schools in your area?
We do have one of those schools in our area, and I have never said a disparaging word about how they choose to train or their path, but they believe that what we are doing is not authentic.
Right.
That somehow, because sometimes we will grab a sleeve, somehow that is less authentic,
right,
than their students not knowing that sometimes someone will grab your sleeve and put a foot on your bicep.
Right.
That somehow my guy's doing an UPA perfectly, and I always tell my students, I didn't even know how to do the UPA until about 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow my students doing an UPA perfectly is different on the mat than it is on the street.
Right. Right. Isn't that crazy? That argument, I know you know this, but that one drives me crazy more than any other. I mean, the circumstances, all of a sudden, the gravity of the circumstances go way up, and now the need for aliveness becomes less. It's completely illogical.
Well, didn't you and Andy were just talking about this, how you fall to the level of your training.
Right.
And the more pressure put on you, the more you will fall to that.
Yeah.
So.
And you and I both know that, and in particular in the case of what you're talking about, it's a way for them to avoid the reality of what happens when you're training combat sport.
It is also because they don't know how to get people good. Now, they might have someone who is good in their gym. I am not denying that one of these sports schools, one of these self-defense BJJ schools doesn't have a guy that could come over to my gym and give everyone a hard time.
Right.
But it is difficult to get everyone that comes into your gym better. And the only way to do that is through aliveness, is through proper drilling.
Right.
And because they don't know how to do that, it is easier just to insulate them from the outside, say that we are doing the street here, we are doing self-defense,
Right.
and then roll in a very limited manner, and then keep everyone from coming in there. I remember Connolly telling me about one of his purple belts who traveled somewhere, and the first gym he called in the area, they said, we don't allow anyone to come over.
Right.
And I understand from a safety standpoint being careful about who comes over, but if someone tells me they train with their purple belt with Chris Connolly, I know that person knows how to train.
Right.
And they're welcome to come. But he was told to go somewhere else.
Yeah. You know what's interesting about what you're saying is a good example of this. And I'm not sure, to be honest with you, I'm not sure exactly why it happens. I fully recognize that I gave you the most nefarious answer. It's one of many options. I mean, the reason why I talked about it being a way for people to kind of protect their egos, because I was talking specifically about a couple students I've had in times past that I saw move away from the kind of training that I think is healthy and that we all do, and move more towards the street aspect of it. But in reality,
no, I'm agreeing. I'm saying they're doing it for the same reason on the ground.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I agree with you.
Like, you rarely see it. You don't see a 27-year-old head coach at a BJJ school who competes and rolls hard, touting, let's all train self-defense. It's always a guy who has gotten 45, 50 years old. Rolling with people is it is difficult as we get older to come to grips with what is really happening.
Right.
And most of our students, especially the ones that have been with us a long time, they're better than us.
Yeah, should be.
Because there is no sport on the planet where a guy at 45 is better than a guy at 25.
Right.
It just doesn't happen. So I agree.
Jiu-jitsu, we can keep up a lot better than we can just about any other sport.
We can keep up. We just have to change our outlook. When we were 25, the outlook was, I'm going to tap that guy every 30 seconds, every minute, or whatever, like just our egos.
Yeah.
And when we're 45, sometimes with a 25-year-old purple belt, it's just being able to do good fundamental jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, and survive and roll another
survive,
day.
Defend, roll another day. Make them work. Be a good training partner.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's tough. It is a lot easier to just say, okay, we focus on the street.
100%. And we see that. But there's another piece too as well. I mean, that's why I was saying I think there are multiple reasons. So I'll run this one by you. And I don't know the answer for this, but Hickson, for example, has made some, I think, valuable and true, worthwhile and reasonable criticisms of IBJJF and the nature of how jiu-jitsu has changed in the 20, 30 years since he started teaching here in the States. And having witnessed that evolution, I understand what he's talking about. I feel like I understand what he's talking about, having talked to him about it, and agree with him. So when I started jiu-jitsu in the 90s, it was very much about fighting. Not the self-defense like somebody's going to put you in a wrist lock or something, what do you do with a drunk guy in the street? There was that, but it was about fighting. Everything we were doing was related to Vale Tudo. The crossover to MMA that's what we were doing. We were doing MMA on the ground, basically. And there was always slaps. Howder, when he first would come to Oregon, I don't think we ever rolled where he didn't hit me in the head at least once or twice. It was just part of what we did. Fighting was what jiu-jitsu was about. And then it hyper specialized, and you have schools and people who are training specifically for the IBJJF rules. And in that there's a fear that the really fearsome, awesome fighting art of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, will get lost. So I understand his point. The solution that he's advocated for it, and what I've seen as far as the self-defense tournament he has, is a kata. It's two guys that go out and do the self-defense techniques, some of which I like and some of which I don't. There are valuable, solid jiu-jitsu movements in the old Gracie self-defense system, and then there's ones that we both know we've made major improvements on. But that's not the point. What I'm talking about is a training method. They're literally working against a cooperating opponent the way you would in Aikido, and then you have a panel of judges who score them like you would kata. And actually, Chris refereed one of these matches, and while he's there, he's wondering, why do you need a referee? I don't understand why I have a referee. And so you have a legitimate problem that I think he's identified, but the solution to it is exactly what we should not do. It will destroy and kill the art. And yet, if we go back, I was thinking about this, if you go back and think about the origin story for every sclerotic tradition, every dead pattern martial art, there's some origin story about somebody who was really, really good and didn't want the movements to be lost, quote unquote. So they codified it in some pattern that then gets repeated, and then the students after that have to memorize and repeat the pattern in front of their coaches. So it just seems like a very human solution that's not a solution. It's actually how things devolve. But anyway, I just find it kind of fascinating, because to me the obvious answer is you just have to do the jiu-jitsu the way we did jiu-jitsu back in the 90s. Not as well, obviously, not as healthier, but with the same.
Right. Well, so a very small percentage of our students are going to compete, and a very small percentage of our students are going to, a much smaller percent of our students are going to laser focus on winning IBJJF gold.
Right.
And there is so much information out there on the internet on all these techniques, all these things, all these games and stuff, that they are going to show up in your gym regardless.
Right.
But I think they are very healthy. And I think even if the guy who's laser focused on getting into the, winning gold at the IBJJF is working lapel guards, things like that.
Right. Worm guard.
It is, as long as the school itself is focusing on fundamentals and training alive, I think it's very healthy.
No, I completely agree with that. I always just let that go, and there's always somebody that's been the newest thing off of YouTube.
Exactly.
So it's not necessary.
And because if we just trained like we used to, then I think, one, we're excluding people, because there are a lot of people who don't, so we're excluding people.
I don't mean
who can,
in the
no, I know. I understand, but even the idea of just striking with all your, most of your jiu-jitsu classes is going to alienate a group of people.
In touch with the hand, right?
Sure, I guess. And I'm not against it. We do it.
Yeah.
But it can shrink.
Yeah.
To the point. So like if
I disagree with that.
If we were just together training no-gi BJJ with strikes, we would get amazing at no-gi BJJ with strikes, and we would be able to fight in any arena and defend ourselves and roll with people without strikes.
Right.
But there is a fun part of evolution, because so many of those matches are going to be closed guard defending versus ground and pound.
Sure.
Right. So I like the idea. I don't do it necessarily, but I like the idea of having that evolutionary or not.
So I completely agree with you, and I don't disagree. And already know that my answer to that is, it's an irrelevant question as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to get even into a debate of gi or no gi, because if you're focused on fundamentals like we do at SBG, our students can cross over to any of them. And we're going to
Yep.
have some that are going to there's going to be a few people that want to do IBJJF, and that's awesome. And a few people that want to fight, and that's awesome. And a whole bunch more who just want to, after they get past the first part of self-defense and become a blue belt, purple belt, it's about the love of and community and everything else. So 100%. What I'm referring to is not any change in our gyms or anything related to. What I'm saying is, when you have somebody that identifies a very legitimate problem.
No, I guess wait, so freeze there. I don't know if it's a legitimate problem. That's my point. So he is solving something
I see.
that I don't think needs to be solved. And the way he is solving it is probably because it doesn't need to be solved.
Well, don't you think, though, to some extent, some of the fighting aspects of jiu-jitsu have given way to, they're not as common as they were certainly in the 90s. The
Sure.
less emphasis on being able to defend yourself against a wrestler, being able to defend yourself against strikes, and the fundamentals of jiu-jitsu that make jiu-jitsu a good fighting art. And then it becomes more about, a point system and gaining advantage. And I'm playing devil's advocate for you.
No, I'm with you.
It's a huge problem, but I do understand his criticism of, and his fear that the jiu-jitsu that he loved and that, he pioneered would get lost over time. I just find it ironic that the solution turns out to be a worse training method.
Right. And the funny thing is, the real solution is making sure that the core fundamentals
Exactly
are always taught and taught properly, and people learn how to drill them properly with aliveness.
Yes. And then it's not a problem.
Then it's not a problem.
Yes.
Now, that is an issue for a lot of places, because there are a lot of black belts who are black belts and run schools because they were very good.
Yeah.
But when they replicate, are they replicating the solid core fundamentals the right way? And I don't believe so.
Right.
So I don't think the issue is necessarily IBJJF and points. Now, we could have a discussion about if it is possible to have a school that tries to balance both things at the same time. That would be an interesting conversation.
We at SBG has solved Hickson's problem. I think that what you just...
Well, I don't know if there is a right. SBG solved it because we never let it become a problem.
Right, because if you're focused on fundamentals and you have a live drilling, it's a non-existent. It's not a problem. You're going to be able to cater to everybody, and the core of the art stays solid. But I guess my broader point is there must be something in us that seeks to codify, I can't think of a better word for it right now, but to preserve things when we're afraid that they're going to get lost in a manner that's not fully alive. I think it must be a tendency. Must be such a common occurrence, because I do believe that's what's happened to just about every traditional martial art along the way.
Were they codified after, or were they always codified?
I think a great deal of them were always that way, because I think the vast majority of them are fairly recent, and it's a con job from the very beginning. But if we want to give some the benefit of the doubt and say, as Burton did, Burton said, well, he believed strongly that back in the day, CLOT was actually functional, and of course, if it was functional, it would look like something like MMA. And he said, yes, I have a video of it. And he sent it to me, and my comment back to him was, yeah, it was a video from the turn of the century, or late 1800s, I think, of guys in Burma doing some form of CLOT, and it looks like bad MMA. It just looks like when you play spar with a little bit of Muay Thai, which is, of course, what I would expect it to look like, right?
So that's, you know, they have competitions now, and
Yeah.
that is basically what it looks like. And it appears to me, although I don't know the rules, it appears to me that they are slap fighting
Yeah.
until one can do one of these final moves. Like, I don't know what they're called, but it looks like, you know, they're slap fighting, they're moving with bad MMA and bad distance management and things until one of them can do like almost like a flying scissor lock
Yeah.
thing, and then they stop it,
Right.
and then I guess that guy wins.
Yeah.
So it's like they're doing, that's how they can say that those things work in an MMA context, but they're cheating
Right.
because neither guy is really doing MMA.
Right.
Because if they were, they wouldn't be that close to each other.
Sure. But, you know, back to what I was saying, there probably was a few systems that were like that were actually functional and then become codified.
Okay.
Way in, you know, if we give them the benefit of the doubt and say at least one or two of them, that is of course always the story. Well, they used to be functional. I don't even think I think my personal opinion, for example, of Wing Chun was it was just bad British boxing. They had some British sailors that rolled into port and beat the crap out of everybody, and had you can look at a lot of what they do and it looks like just like that, and then they just messed it up with some silly forms.
Well, and if that's where you were at 1900,
Right.
then you should not assume that it would evolve in a manner that we have not found now.
Right.
Like that, if those people had stayed isolated, that they would have some super system.
Right.
No, odds are, if those systems were to survive, they would have evolved into what is being done now.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting too that how often people assume that because something's been around for a long time, it must be super valuable or good. It's just a assumption that I think a lot of people have.
It's like the martial arts equivalent to the naturalistic fallacy.
It is, yeah. And I'll remind them that the fact that something's been around for a long time means it's good at replication, but it doesn't mean it's good for us. Astrology's been around for thousands of years. But that's just such a common fallacy that I think people assume that as well. But I'm derailing this. Let's go back to you. So we met.
Okay, so I emailed you.
Yeah.
Because I think I emailed you before I even got the videotapes. I think I emailed you just because the ad about aliveness, I showed it to Rory, and I'm like, he's going to help us balance these things. And then I told Dana that we should go visit my grandparents for a vacation without telling her that I was going to spend all day Saturday at a seminar you were doing in Florida. And was that maybe your first seminar outside of Portland?
Did you come to the first seminar I had?
I did. It was you and Robert, and you were at Luis's school in Hollywood.
Yeah, that was my first seminar out in the United States. My first seminar outside of Oregon was actually in Reunion Island. But that was my first outside seminar. Yeah, that was very early.
Okay.
That would have been probably 90. I don't know. I'm terrible with time as well, but like 92, 94,
okay,
90, something like that. Yeah.
So we did the seminar, and Robert and I rolled at that seminar, and then we went to a chopped chicken place and had sandwiches, and then I went back on my vacation. But that was we were kindred spirits.
Yeah.
Now I still though, and that seminar was it wasn't about necessarily training methods and things. I think at that point you were just sort of sharing your current experience, boxing, clinch, grappling and stuff. I don't think now you always put up a whiteboard and you sort of explain how we got here. But I don't think you were doing that back then.
No, I was talking about aliveness though.
Yeah, no, you certainly were talking about aliveness, but I mean, now your seminars, you take a whiteboard and you sort of lay it out.
Yeah.
But you were definitely talking about aliveness. Obviously, the videotape that shows what aliveness is and what aliveness isn't, even though it's 20 years old, I still put it in my coaching classes. even though my students had never seen stick fighting or some of the things, I still think it's a fantastic demonstration of what is alive and what isn't, what the partner looks like. But I still tried to balance that world. Luis did as well, because Luis and I still went to our Jeet Kune Do camp.
Which is
And
the Vunak one, right?
with Paul Vunak in California, and Majatovich was there, me, Rory, Majatovich, and Luis. We were all there. And I wanted to balance these things because I thought that there was a place for them. But when we went to the camp, it became apparent that when we were doing any kind of training that was alive, we were much happier.
Right.
That it felt more honest than when we were doing training that wasn't alive. And I remember that camp, and I remember, very specifically when most of us, me, Rory, Luis, and Paul, and some others were like, okay, we're done with this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'd rather go over there, put on the gloves, and move around and box. I'd rather get on that mat and do some jiu-jitsu. I'd rather do some real clinch work. Like, if we're here, because we were all 25, 26, 27, we all wanted to just be good fighters.
Right.
Like, MMA had just started, so it wasn't, maybe that's how some of us got taken in at that point. There was really no MMA.
No.
So the only place we were ever going to, quote unquote, fight was going to be on the street.
Right.
So we have this world-class street fighter telling us how to fight on the street. And it's, there is a boxing part, and there is a clinch part, and there is a jiu-jitsu part, because Paul was the first guy doing BJJ in the jiu-jitsu world. Him and Hal Faulkner, is that a real name?
Yeah. Hal Faulkner.
Okay.
He was doing it in the 70s.
No, there you go. Yeah. So that's the type of fighters we thought we were training to be.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't till probably right around that time or a little bit later where another arena opened up, and an arena where we could test. And once you're in an arena where you can test stuff, then things fall away very quickly.
Yeah.
Things go away very, very quickly. And so that mystique or that desire lost any kind of shine for us.
Mm-hmm.
And then at that point, it was just, let's get into boxing gyms so we could box. Let's everybody, let's clinch up. Let's go to a camp where Randy's at. Let's do as much jiu-jitsu as possible. And, let's get together and tap each other and punch each other and take each other down, because that's what's real.
Yeah.
And
when you said it didn't feel honest, that is exactly how I felt about it. And people have asked me before, do you still do Hubad or Samrat or whatever it is? And I don't, of course, but the reason why I don't, I've explained to them, is even if I wanted to, is I think it'd be fun. I would feel dishonest passing that on to my students.
Right.
Which makes it hard for me to relate to people who do both.
And Vunak made an error in judgment with me, because he used the words "trust me." And I remember what the conversation was about. It was me asking him, because he knew Rory and I where our path was going. He saw it, because I was asking questions much more related to your material and why aren't we doing this? And he said at this next camp, he was going to have a pro boxer there. And then we did some training before at his house, and it was stick and knife again. And I said, I thought we were going to really be training, MMA, because MMA is a real thing at this point. And Rory and I were thinking about it,
right.
And he said, this is going to supercharge your attributes. Trust me.
Yeah. Turbocharge.
And that was like, at that point, I'm like, if the best you can do is say, trust me, then, I can't.
Mm-hmm.
Had he brought a boxer there
Mm-hmm.
who had done, he could have tricked us by having a boxer at that camp who said, I am this good because of my training with Paul. Now, at that point in our history, we would have believed it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, eventually we would have figured it out. But had he brought a boxer to camp and let us move around with that guy and do some boxing, and that guy was really good,
Mm-hmm.
and that guy said, here's how I got good, and stick fighting was a big part of it, he might have kept us a little bit longer. But turbocharging attributes, trust me, was not enough for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Paul's videotapes, the ones he made with Panther Productions, were one of the reasons why I went to train Jeet Kune Do after I got out of the Army, because I liked his tape and I liked a lot of what he was saying. And he does deserve a lot of credit because, he was one of the early advocates for Gracie Jiu-Jitsu before it became the thing where all the other Jeet Kune Do people jumped on it because Dan Asano was doing it. And he was actually had trained quite a bit with Hickson. But rather than let go of all that kind of stuff, they put it in a category called self-perfection, which doesn't make any sense. I talked about this a little bit with Burton as well, but
Yeah, I heard.
we both know that the self-actualization parts of what we do come as a result of alive training and the pressure that and lessons that puts on you. And he had such an opportunity and such talent and such an early start to have just let go of that material and gravitated and worked on what was true. There would have been no stopping him,
Yeah, I mean, he deserves, I still give him credit
Yeah.
For, there were things that I learned about fighting from him. He had a
Yeah.
very sharp mind about fighting.
Yeah.
And he had spent some time at that point around some special forces and things. So he understood the ranges and how the ranges expand and contract. He just didn't understand how to train that material. I
Yeah.
think that he was a guy who, he seemed like a really good athlete, very fast, very tough guy. And he got good at fighting, and he understood what aspects made him good at fighting, but I don't think he couldn't have figured out aliveness. He couldn't have figured out the 5 drills. He just couldn't have figured those things out like you did at that point. And so he had nothing to replace the other stuff with. And maybe I'm giving him too much credit, but I can see how maybe it was all hero worship of Dan and Santo. Maybe I'm totally off. But if you want to sell people and train people with your material, it's hard to just fly them out to California and have them box, wrestle, and do jiu-jitsu for 2 days. Now, we would love that.
Right.
But the majority of people who had $3,000 to do that don't want that. They do not want that. And because he didn't understand aliveness, he probably couldn't have found a middle ground like we did,
Mm-hmm.
where anyone can learn stand-up clinch and ground and work it up to the level that they are physically capable of at that point. We can get people sparring in all 3 ranges in a weekend, but it's not going to be full blast, obviously. It's going to be controlled. It's going to be through the use of drills.
Right.
But if we didn't have that, then we end up creating bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
15 count tie pad patterns and the stuff you see boxing coaches do now, and stick and knife and Simbrata and all that shit.
Yeah.
You just replace each of those ranges with something bullshit.
Right.
It's a good way to make money. It is so intellectually, it felt intellectually dishonest to me. So
100%.
But at that camp,
Yeah.
Corey and I both became full instructors under Paul Vunak. and I believe we were already instructors with you. So there was a time period where we were probably the only people in the world to hold those two instructorships.
Well, a lot of the early generation, as you know, outside my students in Oregon, the people that found me and became their first coaches in SBG, even the guys overseas like Carl, were mostly had a JKD background.
Yes, just from different people.
Yeah.
Whose was Carl? Carl was with who?
Carl had, I want to forget his name.
I know the name, but
it's
yeah. Chris Kent? Is that a name?
No, Chris Kent's British guy from the Collie Academy, full Jiu-Jitsu instructor. But no, he trained with his first name was Steve, and last name slips my mind, but he was had a school there in Manchester, and I met him once. He seemed like a nice, genuine guy, and Carl had kind of been his second in command there at the gym, and then found my stuff, and even before finding my stuff, I think was gravitating in the same direction naturally, and just like with me, you wind up, moving apart from that JKD community primarily, just have totally different interests. And he had broken off and opened up his own place the first time I met him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but he had been in the magazines as a JKD instructor, and he was known in the UK as a self-defense, Judo self-defense guy and all that stuff. So he'd been around a long time. So back to you guys. Within 4 or 5 years of starting, when we met and starting training, you're coaching. How long was it before you had Forrest in the UFC?
I don't know. So Forrest is, I believe it's like 16 years ago that TUF won. So 2004.
Okay.
But they were, I think Rory and I fought in 97, I believe. Right. I think that's our first fight. And then I think shortly after that, I think Forrest might have been with us at that point. And then shortly after that, he started fighting. I think there was like a year after that first fight where, we did what we had to do if we really wanted to fight. And then I just became the coach at that point. But then Forrest was there. And then so Rory and Forrest started fighting at that point, which is, 99, maybe 98.
Okay. And I think everybody knows, but for those that don't, obviously you coached your brother, Rory, who fought in the UFC multiple times, Forrest, who was white belt to UFC champion with you, homegrown from Georgia, and also Brian Bowles, right, which is also homegrown for you?
Yeah, so Forrest actually, he won TUF 1 with me, and then he moved to Vegas.
Okay.
Because he met a girl. And
is that his wife?
Yes. And he fought his first few fights with me, and then we cornered him a couple fights, and then, then he just sort of, then his championship fight does not have us in his corner. We did not train him for that.
Okay.
Because at that point, he was doing a lot of stuff for the UFC. He had met this girl, and when he left, Rory had gone on TUF, so he was losing Rory as a training partner. I just had my daughter, so he was going to lose me as a training partner because I actually at that point had a daughter, a gym, was working on my master's, and was working full time. Mm-hmm. And so, we didn't have these large academies at that point. We really only had each other. Mm-hmm. So he had to make this decision for himself. And it was a great, obviously, the best decision he could have made. A few years later, Brian Bowles is my first world champion. That from day one till they put the belt on him, he was nowhere else but with me.
Right. So,
and then I've had a lot of other guys throughout the years, that were homegrown getting the UFC.
Yeah.
People, and then I've had, and then there were a few years where a lot of people were coming to me. A lot of the guys from Georgia would come to me 1 or 2 days a week to fill in that coaching aspect. They had training partners where they were, and they had BJJ coaches, but they needed an MMA coach. So there were a few years where, most, if not all of the big fighters in Georgia were spending time with me.
Right. Well, needless to say, you were one of the pioneer coaches in mixed martial arts. You were there very early on for the UFC. You're still, I know you guys have a big gym that caters to everybody now, but I think you still have a fight team, right?
I do. The thing is, I don't take people anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and because of that, I have to start from zero with everyone, and it is a very long and arduous process to become a fighter. And it's not one that I suggest anyone undertakes. There are obviously, so when you start with, you know, there are so many things that have to go right for someone to become a fighter, for someone to become a good fighter.
Right.
That I have some very promising amateurs right now, and we'll see what the future holds. Obviously, we're on hold right now, but I have about 4 or 5 very promising amateurs now. And we'll see what becomes of them.
Well, either way,
But it is a choice that I made. See, certain coaches are good for certain kinds of people.
yeah.
And I am really only good for very small certain number of people in the sense that if someone wants to become a world champion under me, I am not the type of coach I'm not a motivator, and I'm not a disciplinarian. I lay out my expectations of what you need to do, and those expectations because they're very easy to figure out. It's easy to figure out what it takes to be a world champion. And then I'm like, all right, either do that or don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never, if I have practice Monday night at 8:00, I'm never going to call you or come look for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, there are very few athletes that can do that.
Well, I think that's the same operating standard Kavanaugh has.
Most likely.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't want to chase them down. He talks about that, how he wants the people to be, more naturally motivated. But so,
right.
what I was saying.
And John has had, John has become a place where a lot of people who have started a career have gone to take the next step up.
Yeah.
And John can obviously do that for them. And so, I believe that he is in line for continued success for a long time.
Oh, no doubt. But back to
Connolly has become sort of like that in the Southeast.
Yeah, I'm talking with Chris tomorrow, actually.
Oh, fantastic.
And I was thinking if I can, I'll get that out there because the UFC is Saturday, right?
Yes.
See if I can get it.
And Eric.
Yes. So I'm going to see if I can. I think we're talking from his hotel. So I'm going to see if I can get that up Friday or Saturday for everybody to watch.
Fantastic.
But back to what I was saying, you've been one of the first MMA coaches. You've been an MMA coach in one respect or another for more than 25 years, and you've coached at the highest level. So you're in a unique position to answer some questions about MMA. And the first one that I get asked a lot, and you're in a much better position to answer this than I am, is how have you seen the sport change?
How have I seen the sport change?
Do you think the athletes now are that much better than they were 10 years ago?
I think there are more higher level athletes entering the sport now.
Right.
So here, let me see if I can tackle that in a couple places. One, when we first started, and I don't know the word pioneer, any nice thing said about me eke me out. It make me feel icky inside. So I don't know if I love the word pioneer, but when we started doing this, there were no methodologies other than aliveness that we could apply to it. And so I believe that there are a lot of drills and a lot of things and a lot of methods and a lot of training things that come out of SBG and many of them out of my own gym. So I think that now a lot of, most good gyms have have a good sense of how to train the athletes. And so I think that's a change that's happened over the years. If you went to an MMA event in Georgia 10 years ago, the amateurs, would not, they just would not be very good. You'd have guys who were athletic but had no skill. You'd have guys that maybe wrestled in high school but they didn't know anything else, and they weren't being trained very well. They weren't being cornered very well. I think that has changed in the general sense. So I think the younger guys are getting better training earlier than they ever did before. So that's one thing. Add to that, I think there are more and higher level athletes entering the sport.
The selection, this is much harder now.
It is starting to become that. Like, I think you'd agree that in combat sports, there's probably no selection process that's more brutal than being a boxing champion.
For sure.
MMA is still, most places don't have that level of guys, but it is happening. So the selection process the guys are going through to get in the cage, even as amateurs, is a different level than it ever was before. I've always felt, athlete-wise, I've always felt that if, I'm in Georgia, I'm in Athens, Georgia, so I always felt that if you gave me my pick of maybe 20 guys off the UGA football team, 18-year-old guys off the UGA football team, I could get a couple guys. I could probably get 5 guys who could contend for a championship within 5 years, because that's the level of athlete that we have at Georgia football. Slowly, some of those guys are making their way into MMA. So we are slowly seeing those guys enter MMA. So those are two differences. Technically, we're seeing guys that striking is still a little bit behind in MMA. And I think it goes back to the thing we were talking about before. It just takes a long time to build striking. And maybe every coach is not a great striking coach. There are probably very few really high-level striking coaches.
Good striking coach for MMA seems to be very valuable these days.
Yes. And, there's a value to going to a boxing gym and training with a good boxing coach, but it's still not boxing. It's still MMA.
Right.
And I don't think that so I think you either have coaches who can't build a stand-up fighter from zero, or can't turn a stand-up fighter into an MMA stand-up fighter. But with that being said, I think the skill level across the board has increased, where even now you're seeing amateurs that have some game in each area. So I think those are the major the differences. The athletes, the skill level is higher, and I think the coaching level in general is higher.
What are your predictions for this weekend?
Well, I would never predict anything other than Anders wins and Walt knocks out Overeem.
Right.
So, Connolly, well, he's one of my best friends, and I see SBG Alabama, is our closest SBG gym. I know all the SBG gyms have like a little bit of like a sister gym, or at least the ones that are close enough. So Connolly, and obviously I have Buford now, but Connolly is I've been with him forever. He is one of the best coaches in the world at being able to do all three of those things. Now he has other guys that could teach jiu-jitsu. He has other guys that could teach wrestling, but Connolly and myself, and I don't know how many others, are sort of a dying breed in the fact that we could coach all 3 games. Most guys now have an MMA coach who's good at the overall MMA picture, and then have specialist coaches in each area. But I think Connolly and I are sort of a dying breed in the sense that we could run a show by ourselves, and our athletes won't lose anything. They'll be great jiu-jitsu players. They'll be great clinch players. They'll be great stand-up fighters. So any athlete that Connolly gets in the cage is going to be skilled in all the areas.
Yeah. No, and he obviously loves it, as does John. Such hard work when I see the schedule that both John and Chris have as far as traveling and all those mornings working with your fighter, and people don't realize how much hard work it is, but it's tremendous. That's why I never even gravitated towards that. I'm too lazy for that.
I was lucky enough to have Rory, who could pick up certain slack. He couldn't coach the same way I could, but there were things that Rory could do that took the burden off me. I've had other coaches through the years that were able to take some of that slack off me. Rory did a lot of the traveling. I'm not a big fan of travel.
Yeah.
Like Connolly's travel schedule is ridiculous.
Right.
I still think he also teaches like regular people at 5 a.m. at his gym.
Yeah.
I'm not sure he sleeps.
He works.
You will not outwork Chris. I'll tell you that. You will not outwork Chris or his fighters.
Right.
But the travel part, I also, some fighters just suck. And I don't mean that from like whether they're good at fighting. I just mean as people. And so having to spend multiple hours a day with them and then get in a car and drive 8 hours with them and spend a weekend with them and stuff, it just wasn't something I was willing to do. So that whittled down. One of the things about Forrest was that, and even to this day, the number one question people ask me about Forrest?
You know what?
Do you still talk to him? It's like very important to people that Forrest, it sort of tells people that what they see of Forrest on TV is really what he is.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. Which it is.
And I talked to, we were FaceTiming the other night during the fights.
Yeah.
So, Forrest was someone that I really enjoyed spending time with. And so I liked working with him. Rory is my brother. I like spending time with him. Brian never had to be told to do anything.
Brian, yeah. None of this seems to have ever gone to Forrest's head the way it does.
No.
Yeah, it's good.
He still lives like he's poor.
Yeah.
In his head at least. But he's never outlived his means, if you will. And he there's a funny story I tell about him. When before he retired, Dana said that Chuck Liddell, and Matt Hughes would always have a job with the company. That when they retired, they wouldn't have to worry about working. And I think part of it was to encourage Chuck Liddell to retire and maybe Matt Hughes to retire. But I think it was to show what Forrest had done for the company, because Forrest starts that candle that Connor then just explodes, if you will, lights that candle. I don't know. That's a mixed metaphor that doesn't work, but you know what I'm saying.
I do. Especially with the fan popularity.
Right. And so when Forrest retired, that next Monday morning, he got up and went to the office because he was now in his head, he now worked for the UFC.
Right.
And he didn't really have a job. But every morning he got up and he went to the offices. And every day when I would talk to him, I'd be like, where are you? He's like, he's at the Fertitta's offices, or he's at the gym, like their professional gym, or he's just working. And so a few years later, Chuck and Matt get fired from these jobs. And years later now, Forrest is one of the people running the UFC's Performance Institute.
Right.
He was the one that helped design the program. He's helping to design the future training and codify the future training of all UFC fighters. And, I like to think that, and he would tell you this, but I like to think that some of my DNA is in that.
Sure.
It's nothing I ever would talk about or is important, but it's just something that makes me smile.
Sure.
That when, I told Forrest the other night, I'm like, the job he has now is like, it's the best job he ever could have got from me, because, I get to see and talk about some things that other people don't get to see and talk about, which is pretty cool. So
Yeah.
it keeps me, and it makes me smile that, that
And
he
that's the stuff
just,
you love too, right? Like the training the athletes and the science behind that. It was really
yeah, my true love is selecting athletes and training athletes.
right.
And from a holistic standpoint, like I don't, some people really get into the strength and conditioning, some people get into the nutrition, different areas. I'm really interested in how we select our athletes and what athletes should be selected, and then how to get them to the highest level.
And you
And
mentioned
that
this
is
earlier.
definitely
For people that don't know, your day job is a scientist, right?
my day job. Is I go to a lab and grow viruses and make vaccines, but I do it for animals. Every time I tell someone that, they say, go make a coronavirus vaccine.
Right.
Like, I have made many coronavirus vaccines. You just are not a pig or a chicken or a dog.
I didn't know that. We have them for animals.
Yes. In pigs, it's porcine endemic diarrhea. For dogs, it's canine corona. For chickens, it is not a chicken guy, but it's a bronchitis, infectious bronchitis, IBV maybe. Someone will correct me. I think that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, coronavirus is most species have some coronaviruses that affect them. So I made plenty of coronavirus vaccines, and just none of them for humans.
Right. Do you think we're
Although
going
if it got
to, before we get off, before I change the subject here rapidly, do you think we're going to have for humans?
uh, eventually, because the
For COVID?
technology, right? So the answer to that question is yes, of course. It's making vaccines is relatively easy.
Okay.
Um, it is a technology that's been with us for since Jenner, and we still make vaccines in a very similar manner. So I do believe that it'd be pretty easy to make some of the older style vaccines, what we call attenuated, where you grow it and you select and you pressure it until it's no longer infectious. And that technology, again, that's Jenner's technology. That'll be pretty easy to do. The issue is the ones that are going to come out first are the ones that are going to use new technologies that are probably safer in some senses, but less well known in other senses. And so I think we will have something, but I don't know if we'll have it within a year. And I fear if another country comes up with it first.
Why?
Let's say hypothetically China comes up with the vaccine first.
Yeah.
Now, do they, out of some sense of guilt, give American pharmaceutical companies a stock of that and say, go ahead and make it? Or do they make it in their production facilities for their people first, which puts the population of China 6 months to a year ahead of us while we still grapple with this virus?
Hmm.
It is very important that we and or one of our closest allies win the vaccine race. Now, it looks like England is doing very well. It looks like Israel is doing very well. It looks like we have some candidates. It looks like Johnson & Johnson is actually going to front the money to make one of the candidates before it even goes through safety testing. So, but that is a very important race for us to win from just a geopolitical standpoint.